It was just past noon on a Saturday. Lunch was over sandwiches, iced tea, nothing special, and Savannah sunlight was pouring through the hallway window, golden and warm. I looked at Julia and said, "Would you marry me?" I was joking. At least I thought I was. But she didn't laugh. She set her glass down, and her eyes locked onto mine for the first time in 7 years. I couldn't read them. She took my hand and led me toward the staircase without a word. Her hand was warm, but it trembled. By the fifth step, I knew I'd never said anything more honest. To understand why she led me upstairs that afternoon, you need to hear the whole story. If this story resonates with you, drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment where a joke turned into the truest thing you ever said? My name is Adam. I'm 34 years old, and I restore antique woodwork for a living. Staircases, mantels, pocket doors, dining tables, anything old and forgotten that somebody once brought back to life. I work mostly in the historic district of Savannah, Georgia, where the houses have more stories than the people who live in them. It's quiet work, repetitive. You sand, you stain, you wait, you sand again. Some guys would lose their minds doing what I do, but I've always liked the patience of it. Wood doesn't lie to you. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. You run your hand across a plank of walnut, and it tells you exactly what it is, every ring, every knot, every year of its life right there under your fingers. I have a small workshop in my garage workbench against the back wall. Hand planes on pegs, a thick smell of oak and linseed oil that never leaves. On sunny mornings, the light catches the sawdust floating in the air and the whole room glows. That garage is the only place I've ever felt completely myself. I live alone in a 2-story colonial that I bought after my divorce 3 years ago. It needed work when I got its sagging porch, cracked plaster, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since 1972, but that was the point. I wanted something to fix, something that wouldn't talk back. My marriage to Megan lasted 4 years, and it ended the way a lot of marriages end, not with a bang, but with a slow, exhausting fade. She wanted a different version of me, more ambitious, more social, more everything. I didn't hate her for it. I was just tired. Tired of being reminded that who I was wasn't enough. After the divorce, I built a life that fit me the way a good pair of work boots fits broken in. Comfortable, nothing extra. I woke up before dawn, spent the day elbow deep in sawdust. Afternoons I ran through Forsyth Park. Evenings I sat on the porch with a book, the ceiling fan turning slow circles above me, and watched the light die over the rooftops. I talked to the wood more than I talked to people. I told myself that was fine, but looking back, I think I was hiding and calling it peace. Julia came into my life 7 years ago, before Megan, before the marriage, before any of it. She's a preservation architect, freelance, specializing in the restoration of historic homes. We met on a job site. I was rebuilding a staircase in a Victorian on East Jones Street, and she was redrawing the original blueprints from faded photographs older than both of us. She walked over to inspect my joinery, and I braced for criticism. Instead, she said, "You matched the grain direction. Nobody does that anymore." That was it. That was the beginning of everything. Julia was the kind of person you didn't realize you needed until she wasn't there. She remembered that I drank my coffee black, no sugar. She knew I hated the sound of phone ringtones, so she always texted instead of calling, except once. The night I signed my divorce papers at 2 in the morning, my phone rang. Julia. I picked up, and she didn't say, "Are you okay?" She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She said, "I'm at the waffle place on Bull Street. You coming?" I went. We sat in that fluorescent-lit diner and ate waffles until the sun came up. And she never asked me a single question about Megan. That was the thing about Julia, she never asked if I was sad. She just showed up in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. And I, like every slow-moving man who doesn't know what's standing right in front of him, called it friendship. Then one afternoon, about 2 months before that Saturday lunch, Julia called me. Her voice was normal, but just a little faster than usual. "Adam, my lease is up. The landlord's not renewing. I need a place to stay for a few weeks. Would that be okay?" I said yes without thinking. It was Julia. Of course she could stay. But here's what I didn't know then. What I'm telling you now, Julia had chosen not to renew. Her landlord offered to extend the lease. She declined. She had already decided to come to my house before she ever picked up the phone. And it took Megan exactly 2 days to hear about it. The day Julia moved in, she brought 2 suitcases and a single box of architectural drawings. That was it. No furniture, no lamps, just clothes and blueprints, and a leather pouch of pencils zipped in her bag. I carried the heavier suitcase upstairs to the guest room while Julia followed with the box balanced on her hip, her footsteps careful on the old wooden treads that groaned under our weight. I left a spare key on the kitchen counter and said, "Make yourself at home." She picked up the key, looked around the kitchen, and smiled. "Your home has about 3 door hinges that need replacing, by the way." That night, we fixed the bathroom door together. I held it steady while she worked the screws with a Phillips head she'd pulled from my toolbox in the hall closet. She hadn't asked where it was, she just knew. And something about that, the way she moved through my house like she'd already memorized the layout, should have told me everything. But I wasn't ready to hear it. That same afternoon, while we were carrying the second suitcase up the stairs, a small silver button popped off the cuff of my old flannel shirt. It bounced twice on the wooden steps and rolled to a stop near the landing. I didn't notice. I was already at the top, the suitcase heavy on my shoulder, sweat on my forehead, thinking about nothing but setting it down. But Julia noticed. She paused on the third step, bent down, picked up that tiny button, and slipped it into the pocket of her jacket without a word. I want you to hold on to that detail. It matters later. The first week was all polite boundaries. Julia kept the guest room door closed. She folded the bathroom towels and hung them in a neat row. She asked before using the stove, even though I'd told her she didn't have to. There was a formality to it, like two colleagues at a conference, respectful, careful, aware of the edges. But underneath that, something was already shifting. Julia didn't just exist in my house. She fit into it. She fit into the silences I had built around myself without asking for a single one to change. By the second and third week, a rhythm had formed, something so quiet and natural that I didn't recognize it as intimacy until much later. Julia woke up before me every morning, which was remarkable because I was usually up before the sun. But every day when I walked into the garage, there was a cup of black coffee sitting on my workbench. No note, no fanfare, just coffee. Exactly how I drank it, still warm. In return, though, I didn't think of it as a return at the time I started buying oat milk. The kind she used. I put it in the fridge beside my regular half and half, and neither of us ever mentioned it. It was just there. Evenings were their own quiet ceremony. Julia sat at the kitchen table sketching restoration plans, her pencil moving in clean, confident lines across tracing paper, while I worked in the garage, varnishing a chair or sanding down a tabletop. I kept the door between the kitchen and the garage propped open with a piece of scrap wood, and sometimes Julia would call out through the doorway without looking up, "Walnut or oak?" And I'd say, "Walnut?" And she'd say, "That's what I thought." 3 sentences. Never more, but never less than enough. I told myself this was just two friends coexisting, that it was efficient, practical, convenient. Julia didn't try to change anything about the house. She didn't suggest painting the walls or buying new furniture or rearranging anything. She simply filled the spaces I hadn't known, were empty: the second chair at the kitchen table, the quiet that used to sit where her pencil sounds now lived, the absence of another person's breathing in the house after dark. Then came the storm. 4 weeks after Julia moved in, a late-season thunderstorm rolled through Savannah and knocked the power out across half the historic district. Rain slammed the tin roof of the garage like a drum. I was downstairs lighting candles when I heard something from the upstairs hallway. Not a sound exactly, more like the opposite of sound. A held breath, a stillness that felt wrong. I grabbed a candle and went up. Julia was sitting on the hallway floor outside the guest room. Her back was pressed against the wall, her knees drawn up, a pillow clutched to her chest. A flashlight sat beside her, turned off. She was afraid of thunder. 7 years I'd known this woman through job sites and late-night waffle runs and divorce papers and holidays and every ordinary Tuesday in between, and I had no idea she was afraid of storms. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't ask what she needed. I just sat down beside her, set the candle on the floor between us, and listened to the rain. We sat like that for a long time. The candlelight flickered on the wooden walls, casting shadows that swayed like slow dancers. The thunder came and went in waves, and each time it cracked, I felt Julia flinch beside me, not dramatically, just a small tightening of her shoulders, a quick intake of breath. After a while, she said quietly, almost to herself, "When I was little, every time there was a storm, my mom would sit next to me just like this. She wouldn't say anything. She'd just be there." I didn't respond. I just let my shoulder press a little closer to hers. When the power finally came back on an hour later, the hallway lights snapping on with a harsh, ordinary click, Julia stood up and said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" I didn't do anything. She gave me a small, tired, real smile. "Exactly," she said. "You didn't do anything. That's why." A few days after the storm, I was cleaning out the garage, sweeping sawdust, sorting scrap wood, emptying the recycling bin into the larger bin outside, when I found something at the bottom of the pile. Julia's old lease agreement, crumpled, tossed away, half covered by junk mail. I smoothed it out on my workbench and read it in the light that came through the window. The landlord's renewal offer was printed clearly on the second page. He was willing to extend for another 12 months at the same rate. The checkbox next to "Tenant declines to renew" was marked. Julia's signature was at the bottom. I stood there in the garage, holding that piece of paper, sawdust floating in the light around me, and I didn't know what I felt. Something between confusion and something warmer that I couldn't name, but I didn't ask her about it. I folded the paper, put it back in the bin, and walked inside. I told myself if she wanted to tell me, she would tell me. But after that day, I started noticing things I had been too blind or too stubborn to see before. The way Julia looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, quick glances across the kitchen that lingered half a second too long. A softness in her eyes that vanished the instant I turned my head. The way she straightened my collar before I left for a job in the morning, her fingertips careful and precise, never quite touching my skin, as if she had drawn an invisible boundary around the space between us and was terrified of crossing it. The way she made pot roast on Sundays, slow-cooked, with rosemary and garlic, exactly the way I liked it. Nobody else in our friend group even liked pot roast. She made it for me. Only for me. One evening, Julia was sitting on the porch steps watching the fireflies rise from the garden, and she said, without looking at me, "You know what I like most about this house?" I said, "What?" She said, "The staircase. It creaks in all the right places at all the right times." She paused. "Kind of like you." I laughed. She didn't. Then Megan texted me. I was in the garage, phone sitting on the workbench next to the coffee mug Julia had left that morning. The screen lit up. "Heard Julia moved into your house." Interesting, she always wanted that. I stared at the message for a long time, then I deleted it. But the words stayed lodged in my head like a splinter I couldn't quite reach, buried just deep enough to ache whenever I pressed on it. It was a Saturday afternoon 5 weeks after Julia moved in, when Megan's white SUV pulled into the driveway. I was on the porch replacing a section of railing. A piece of cedar braced against my knee, and I heard the engine before I saw the car. The crunch of gravel, the click of a door. And then Megan stepped out the way she always did, heels on the ground first. Sunglasses pushed up into her hair, perfume arriving a full step before she did. "Adam, I need to talk to you. Privately." Julia was in the kitchen. I knew she could hear through the open window, but she didn't come outside. Megan walked into the house like she still owned half of it. Her eyes swept the room with a precision I recognized from our marriage. She was cataloging. Julia's sandals by the front door, 2 coffee mugs on the counter instead of 1, a rolled-up architectural blueprint pinned to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Georgia. Megan ran her fingertip along the edge of the blueprint and smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the ending of a conversation. "She's made herself right at home, hasn't she?" she said. It wasn't a question. She told me she needed me to re-sign a property division clause, something about the house valuation that her lawyer had flagged for renegotiation. She pulled a manila folder from her bag and set it on the kitchen table, leafing through pages with a deliberate slowness that told me the documents were a prop. She wasn't here for paperwork. Megan didn't care about property clauses. She wanted to see Julia's sandals by the door, and the 2 mugs in the dish rack, and the blueprint on the fridge. She wanted to stand inside my house and measure how much of it belonged to Julia now. She wanted the distance between Julia and me to be small enough to confirm what she had always believed, that Julia had been waiting in the wings. And the moment our marriage ended, she stepped into the light. She pulled me out onto the porch and lowered her voice, not quite a whisper, but pitched at that precise volume designed to carry just far enough through the open kitchen window. Julia would hear every word if she listened, and Megan knew she would listen. "You know she's been in love with you since before we got married, right?" Megan said, leaning against the railing with her arms folded. "I knew. I always knew. Every dinner party, every holiday, every time the 3 of us were in a room together, I watched her watch you. She never hid it from anyone except you." She tilted her head, studying my face the way a poker player studies a hand. "And you honestly think it's a coincidence that she lost her apartment? That her lease just happened to expire right when you were living alone in this big empty house? Come on, Adam. You can't be that naive." I said nothing. Not because I was shocked, I wasn't, but because what she said matched the lease I'd found in the recycling bin 3 weeks earlier. The same fact, just wrapped in different language. Megan read my silence as victory. She crossed her arms and leaned back with a look of satisfied certainty. "See?" she said. "She's been manipulating you this whole time." Then the screen door creaked open, and Julia stepped out onto the porch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She looked at Megan with a steadiness that was almost unsettling, then looked at me and said in a voice as flat and clean as a carpenter's level, "Megan's right. I chose not to renew my lease. I chose to come here." And then she turned around, walked back inside, climbed the stairs, and closed the guest room door behind her. No explanation, no apology, no defense, no trembling. Just the truth, laid flat on the table like a hand of cards she was finished holding. Megan smiled, the kind of smile that's really a weapon. She picked up her sunglasses, left the paperwork on the counter like a calling card, and walked back to her car without looking back. I heard the engine start, the tires crunching on gravel, and then the street went quiet again. A mockingbird was singing somewhere in the live oak by the fence. going through its entire repertoire as if absolutely nothing had happened. I stood on the porch with a hammer in my hand, and the smell of fresh-cut cedar all around me and the afternoon sun pressing down on my shoulders. And I waited for the anger to come. Megan wanted me to be angry. She had come here specifically to plant that seed to make me feel deceived, used, foolish. She wanted me to replay every moment Julia and I had shared in this house and see it through a new lens. A lens Megan had carefully polished and handed to me. She wanted me to see Julia the way she saw Julia, as a schemer, a manipulator, a woman who had engineered her own homelessness to worm her way into my life. But I stood there on that porch, and the only thing I could think was this: Julia is afraid of thunder. Julia makes my coffee at 5 in the morning. Julia knows I prefer walnut over oak, and Julia chose to come here not by accident, not by desperation, but by choice. If that was manipulation, then it was the gentlest, most patient kind anyone had ever done to me. Megan told me Julia was manipulating me, but Megan forgot something important. I'm a woodworker. I spend my life running my hands over surfaces, feeling for the truth beneath the finish. And I know the difference between solid wood and veneer. That night, Julia didn't come downstairs for dinner. I cooked rice and roasted chicken simple, the kind of meal that doesn't ask for anything, and made a plate for her. I carried it upstairs, set it on the floor outside her closed door, and knocked once, lightly. Then I went back down and sat on the porch swing and listened to the crickets. An hour later, I went back up. The plate was empty. The door was still closed. She had eaten. That meant she was still here. That night, that was enough. The days that followed were the quietest the house had ever been, quieter even than the 3 years I'd spent living there alone. Julia stayed, but she kept her distance with a precision that felt almost architectural, as if she had drawn new walls between us that only she could see. No coffee on my workbench in the morning, no voice calling through the garage doorway, walnut or oak, no pencil sounds from the kitchen table in the evenings. She left the house before I woke up and came home after dark, and when we passed each other in the hallway, she kept her eyes on the floor. The house felt emptier with her in it than it had when I was the only one inside, because now I knew what fullness sounded like, and the silence where her presence used to be was louder than any sound. I kept the door between the kitchen and the garage open every evening, out of habit or hope or stubbornness. Nobody called through it. The doorway just stood there, empty, like a sentence that someone had started and never finished. Megan sent one final text. Is she still there? Or did she finally have the decency to leave? I blocked her number, put the phone in the kitchen drawer, and closed it. 5 days of silence. 5 days of walking past her closed door and hearing nothing. 5 days of the staircase, creaking under only one set of footsteps. 5 mornings of walking into the garage and finding the workbench bare no coffee, no warmth, no sign that anyone in this house noticed whether I was awake. I left plates outside her door each evening. By morning they were empty. That was our only conversation: food left and food taken. A language of trays and closed doors. Then I came home from a job site on a Tuesday afternoon, sawdust still on my forearms, and saw Julia's suitcase standing at the bottom of the stairs. The same suitcase I had carried up to the guest room the day she moved in. She was on the landing above, folding clothes into a bag, her back to me. My chest went hollow, not the kind of hollow that comes with sadness, but the kind that comes with fear. Pure, choking, airless fear. It was the same feeling I'd had the day I signed my divorce papers, except worse. Much worse. Because when Megan left, I was sad. When Julia was getting ready to leave, I panicked. And that difference, the distance between sadness and panic, told me everything I had been too slow, too cautious, too afraid to understand. I stood at the bottom of the staircase and said her name. Julia. She stopped folding but didn't turn around. Her shoulders went still. I said, I found the lease in the recycling bin. Weeks ago. She didn't move. I know you chose to come here, and I didn't ask you about it, not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid that if I asked, the answer would change everything, and I wasn't ready for everything to change. Julia turned around slowly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but she wasn't crying. She came down 2 steps and stopped, one hand on the railing, the other pressed flat against her thigh like she was holding herself in place. She looked at me the way people look at a door they're about to walk through for the last time, memorizing it. Then she spoke, and her voice was steady, but barely. Adam, I've been in love with you since before you married Megan. I went to your wedding. I wore a blue dress and I smiled for every photograph, and I went home and cried until the sun came up. 7 years I carried that. 7 years of sitting across from you at dinner and pretending that the way my chest tightened when you walked into a room was just the weather. And when you got divorced, I didn't come to you right away. I waited 3 years because I refused to be the woman who swoops in when a man is broken. The lease was the only chance I had to be near you without having to say any of this out loud. It was the only door I could walk through without explaining why I was knocking. But Megan kicked that door open and stood there pointing at me like I was something to be ashamed of. She turned it into something ugly, and I couldn't stay here and watch you look at me the way she wanted you to. I don't look at you like that, I said. She held my gaze. Then how do you look at me? I didn't answer with words. I stepped up one stair, then another. The wood creaked beneath me, the same sound it always made. The sound Julia said she loved. I reached for her hand. It was warm. It trembled. It felt exactly the way it had felt that afternoon I told you about, at the beginning of the afternoon. That started with a joke and ended on the fifth step. I look at you like the person I want to make coffee for every morning, I said. Not for a few weeks. Not until you find a new apartment. Forever. Julia smiled. It was the first real smile I'd seen from her in 5 days, and it changed the entire staircase, the light, the air, the weight of every word that had been said between those walls. She squeezed my hand and led me up the remaining steps without saying another word. At the top of the stairs, she pushed open the guest room door, and there on the nightstand, beside the lamp, was the silver button, the one that had popped off my flannel shirt the day she moved in, the one I never noticed falling. She had kept it all that time first in her jacket pocket, then placed on the nightstand where she could see it every morning when she woke up, a tiny silver circle catching the light from the window. Beside the button was a small drawing on tracing paper, done in pencil, the clean, precise lines of an architect who draws the way other people breathe. It was a blueprint for an expanded woodworking shop, drawn to the exact scale of my house. A drafting table positioned by the window for natural light. A wider workbench with storage underneath. Room for 2 sets of tools, 2 sets of hands, 2 people working side by side. She had drawn our future before I even knew I wanted one. If you want me to leave, I'll leave, she said quietly, standing beside the nightstand with the button and the blueprint behind her like evidence in a trial she never wanted to go to. But I'm done pretending. I picked up the silver button and held it in my palm. It was smaller than I remembered. Lighter. Just a piece of metal that had fallen off an old shirt. But she had caught it. She had kept it. And now it sat in my hand like a promise neither of us had spoken until this moment. Stay, I said. And that was all either of us needed to hear. Nothing changed overnight. That's not how real things work. Julia stayed in the guest room. I stayed in mine. She drew at the kitchen table. I varnished furniture in the garage. The house looked the same from the outside, but inside the walls inside us, something had shifted, like a foundation settling into place after years of being slightly off-center. The coffee came back. Every morning. Black, no sugar, still warm, sitting on my workbench when I walked into the garage before dawn. And I started leaving something for Julia, in return a single jasmine blossom from the bush in the backyard, placed beside her coffee mug on the kitchen counter. Neither of us mentioned it. Not once. It just happened. Every morning, coffee and jasmine, a conversation conducted entirely in gestures. In the evenings, the door between the kitchen and the garage stayed open, propped with the same piece of scrap wood as before. But now, when I looked up from sanding a tabletop or fitting a joint, I would catch Julia watching me through the doorway, and she didn't look away anymore. She held my gaze, gave me a small, quiet smile, and then turned back to her blueprints. That was how Julia said I love you, not with words, but with her eyes, with her presence, with the simple, deliberate act of not turning away. By the second month, our lives had woven together so closely that separating them would have required a seam ripper and a level of emotional surgery neither of us was interested in. Julia started taking on restoration projects in the neighborhood, old Victorians and Greek revivals with sagging porches and water-stained ceilings, and she hired me as her carpenter. We worked together during the day, measuring and cutting and fitting pieces of old houses back together, and we came home to the same kitchen at night. The neighbors on the street started calling us the old house couple. Julia laughed when she heard it, a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and climbs up through the throat. I heard it too, and for the first time I didn't correct anyone. I didn't say we're just friends or she's just staying for a while. I just let it be true. One evening in early autumn, Julia was sitting on the porch watching the last light fade behind the live oaks, the air thick with the smell of jasmine and warm earth. I brought out 2 cups of tea and sat down on the step beside her. She took her mug, blew on it, and said, "You know what this house is missing?" I said, "What?" She said, "A porch swing, the kind that seats 2. She didn't look at me when she said it. She just watched the fireflies rising from the garden like slow sparks. That weekend, I built one. Cedar planks, sanded smooth, chains hung from the porch ceiling on heavy-gauge hooks I set myself, wide enough for 2 people, but only just barely the kind of swing where sitting close wasn't optional. It was the design. And every evening after that, we sat on it together, the chains creaking softly as we rocked, and neither of us ever said out loud that it was perfect. 6 months after that afternoon on the staircase, Julia moved her things from the guest room to mine. There was no announcement, no formal conversation about it, no defined moment where one of us said, "Let's do this." I just came upstairs one evening and found her architectural drawings stacked neatly on the nightstand on the other side of the bed, a pair of her reading glasses folded on top, her pencil pouch tucked into the drawer. Julia never moved in. She just stayed, day by day, until the boundaries between guest room and bedroom stopped meaning anything at all. Megan reached out one last time through her lawyer. Not directly. A letter on legal stationery, formal and final. The property paperwork was settled. All clauses resolved. I signed the document at the kitchen table, sealed it in the return envelope, and mailed it without reading the fine print. That night, Julia asked, "Everything okay?" I said, "It's done." She looked at me for a long moment. "Really done?" I said, "It's been done for a long time." A year after Julia first came to stay, I finished building the expanded workshop constructed exactly according to the pencil blueprint she had drawn on that piece of tracing paper. There was a long drafting table beside the new window for her restoration designs, a wider workbench with room for 2 sets of tools, shelves along the back wall for my hand planes and her rolled-up drawings, and a wide window that looked out over the backyard, where the jasmine had grown wild along the fence in thick, fragrant clusters. Julia had designed that shop for 2 people, but when I built it for 3 because somewhere in the quiet of all those mornings and evenings, I had begun imagining a child, small hands reaching for wood shavings, a high voice asking, "What are you making, Daddy?" I didn't say that part out loud, but I think Julia knew. I didn't buy a diamond ring. I went to the guest room nightstand, the one that was now Julia's side of our bed, and I took the silver button, the same button that had popped off my flannel shirt the day she moved in. The same button she had picked up without me knowing and kept for 7 months. I brought it to a silversmith on Broughton Street and asked him to set it into a plain silver band. Nothing elaborate, nothing showy, just a button on a ring, on an ordinary afternoon, after an ordinary lunch sandwiches and iced tea, just like before I stood at the bottom of the staircase, the same spot where Julia's suitcase had stood the day she almost left, the same spot where I had said her name and watched her turn around. The midday sun came through the hallway window exactly the way it had the first time, warm, golden, the kind of light that doesn't let you hide. I said, "Julia, would you marry me?" And this time I wasn't joking. This time I was holding a ring with a silver button where the stone should have been. Julia looked at the ring, looked at me. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Then she reached for my hand and led me up the staircase step by step, the wood creaking beneath us, her hand warm and steady in mine. The sunlight fell across the stairs in the same golden stripes. And on the 5th step, the same step where everything had changed the first time, she whispered, "Yes." Her answer wasn't on her lips. It was on the staircase. The place where everything began, and the place where everything was made complete. People ask me sometimes, "When did you know you were in love with Julia?" And I never have a clean answer for that. There was no lightning bolt. There was no single moment where the sky cracked open and a voice announced, "This is the one." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just a lot of mornings waking up, padding into the garage in the early dark, finding a cup of black coffee on the workbench, still warm, and thinking, "This is the life I want." Julia didn't come into my world like a storm. She came like spring in Savannah, slow, warm, almost invisible, and by the time I noticed, everything had already bloomed. That silver button, it's just a button. A small, round piece of metal that fell off an old flannel shirt on a random afternoon. It shouldn't mean anything. But Julia picked it up when I wasn't looking, slipped it into her pocket, kept it on her nightstand for 7 months, and now it sits on her ring finger, catching the light every time she turns a page of her blueprints. I think love is like that sometimes. It isn't something you go out and search for. It's something someone quietly keeps for you, holds it safe, carries it close until the day you're finally ready to see that it was there all along. If you're lucky, truly, deeply lucky, there's a person in your life who never walks away, even when you never once asked them to stay. So let me ask you this. Do you have a Julia? Someone who's been standing beside you for so long that you forgot to wonder why they're still there? And if you do, have you told them what they mean to you? If this story touched something in your chest, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment below. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.